The cold seeped through the floorboards. First, a phantom touch crawling up from the dirt beneath the cabin. It was the silence, however, that truly woke Amelia Hawthorne. Not the gentle quiet of a Wyoming night filled with the distant call of a coyote or the whisper of wind through lodgepole pines, but a dead hollow void where the sound of a man's breathing should have been. Her eyes snapped open. The hearth was a mound of pale ash, and the space beside her on the corn-husk mattress was an empty, cold depression. A metallic taste of fear flooded her mouth. "Jack," she whispered the name, a fragile puff of smoke in the frigid air. She rose, her worn nightgown offering no defense against the chill. The cabin's single room was a study in shadows, the moonlight through the grimy window pane painting stark silver lines across the rough-hewn table and the two rickety chairs. The door stood slightly ajar, a blacker rectangle against the night, swinging on a leather hinge with a soft, mournful creak. He was gone. Again. But this time felt different. Final. A sudden, frantic energy seized her. Her gaze darted around the room, cataloging the missing items with a speed born of dread. The Winchester rifle was gone from its pegs above the mantel. The leather pouch where they kept their meager coins, earned from trapping and selling pelts, was absent from its nail by the door. And on the table where her small tin box of keepsakes should have been there was only an empty space. A choked sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped her throat. She stumbled toward the table, her hands tracing the dust where the box had sat. Inside had been a few pressed flowers from her mother's garden back east, a lock of her own hair from her wedding day, and the one thing that tethered her to a life before this harsh, unforgiving land, a small silver locket on a delicate chain. It had been her mother's, passed down on her deathbed, with a whispered promise to keep it safe, to remember the gentle world she had left behind. No, she breathed the word of prayer. Jack, no. The memory of the last night crashed down on her. The reek of cheap whiskey on his breath, his eyes bloodshot and cruel. The argument had been the same as always, a bitter storm of his failures and her quiet, resilient hope. He had accused her of holding him back, of being a constant, silent judgment on his inability to strike it rich. She had pleaded with him to think of their son Elias, asleep in his cot in the corner. The argument had escalated until his rage found a physical target. He had lunged for the tin box. "You and your fancy trinkets." He'd snarled his words, slurring. "Think you're better than me with your mother's locket and your Eastern airs." She had fought him for it, her hands clawing at his wrists. "It's all I have left of her, Jack, please." He was stronger. He had shoved her back, and she had stumbled, her head cracking against the log wall. The world had spun into a constellation of black spots. Through the haze, she saw him pocket the locket, his face a mask of spiteful triumph. "Maybe I'll trade it for a decent bottle," he had spat before turning to his other thefts. Now the silence in the cabin was his final answer. A faint whimper came from the corner cot. Elias. Her son, her 3-year-old anchor in a world tilting off its axis. Shoving down her own rising panic, she crossed the room and knelt beside him. He was curled into a tight ball, his small face scrunched in sleep, his breath a warm, steady puff against her cheek. She gently smoothed the tangled blonde hair from his forehead, her touch trembling. He was all she had, and she was all he had. She gathered him into her arms, his small, warm body, a stark contrast to the encroaching cold. She held him tight, rocking back and forth on the hard-packed dirt floor, the rhythmic motion a desperate attempt to soothe a pain that ran deeper than any bruise. The silver locket was more than just metal and memory. It was a symbol of a promise of a past where she was cherished and a future she had believed in. Jack hadn't just stolen an heirloom. He had ripped away the last thread of that identity, leaving her adrift. Outside, the sound of a horse's gallop faded into the vast, indifferent darkness of the Wyoming Territory. Amelia held her sleeping son, the cold reality settling over her like a shroud. Survival was no longer an abstract concept. It was a wolf at the door, and the door had just been kicked wide open. Her goal was no longer just to endure. It was to get that locket back. It was to reclaim the piece of herself Jack had stolen. It was to find a future for the small, dreaming boy in her arms, even if she had to carve it out of the wilderness with her bare hands. The journey to Lonesome Gulch was a pilgrimage through a sun-blasted hell. The red sand glowed under the unforgiving sun, each grain a tiny ember against the cracked leather of her boots. Shimmering heat warped the horizon into a watery mirage, a cruel trick that promised an oasis where there was only more scorched earth. Amelia walked, placing one foot in front of the other, with a grim mechanical rhythm. The world had shrunk to the next step, and the next, and the next. Elias, slung on her hip, had ceased his whimpering. His small body was a leaden weight, his head lolling against her shoulder in a stupor of heat and exhaustion. His silence was more terrifying than his cries. The desert was a vast, indifferent canvas. Short, stabbing thoughts punctuated the endless trek. Water, shade, one more mile. Then longer flowing sentences of despair would wash over her as she scanned the immense empty landscape. The sky stretched on forever, a faded blue sheet bleached by a relentless sun, offering no comfort, no sign of life. Only the slow circling shadow of a vulture high above. Every description that her mind conjured served only to heighten her desperation. The skeletal remains of a Joshua tree looked like a gnarled hand reaching from a grave. The wind, when it stirred, was not a cooling breeze, but the hot breath of a furnace carrying the scent of dust and decay. It whispered of failure, of bones bleached white under the pitiless sky. She had no prior knowledge of this land, no map but the vague direction a passing trapper had given Jack months ago. She was an Easterner, a creature of green hills and predictable seasons, dropped into a world of violent extremes. When the ragged cluster of buildings finally appeared shimmering on the horizon, she wasn't sure if it was another mirage. Lonesome Gulch. It didn't look like a place of salvation. It looked like a collection of driftwood washed up on the shore of a dead sea, huddled together for grim company. The town's main street was a wide, rutted scar of dried mud and horse droppings. Men with faces like tanned leather watched her from the shaded porches of the Rusty Spur Saloon and the general store. Their eyes, narrowed against the glare, held a hard, appraising quality that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. They weren't seeing a woman in need. They were seeing a problem astray to be kicked or ignored. A woman in a drab calico dress sweeping the porch of a small clapboard house paused, her gaze sweeping over Amelia's tattered skirts and dust-caked face. Her mouth twisted into a sneer of contempt before she spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust and turned her back. The rejection was as sharp and sudden as a slap. Amelia's pride, a fragile thing she had nurtured through the hardships of her marriage, threatened to crumble. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and marched toward the one building that promised some semblance of order, the sheriff's office. It was a squat adobe structure with a tin star nailed crookedly above the door, as if an afterthought. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Behind a scarred wooden desk sat a man who seemed to have been carved from the same unforgiving landscape as the town itself. Sheriff Elias Thorne was a bull of a man, his considerable gut straining the buttons of his vest. His boots were propped on a stack of yellowed warrants, and he was idly flipping a silver coin between thick, sausage-like fingers. He didn't bother to stand. He simply watched her approach, a lazy, predatory smile playing on his lips, revealing teeth yellowed by chewing tobacco. "Well now," he drawled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Look what the dust dragged in. You look like Trouble's favorite bride, ma'am." The carefully constructed words she had rehearsed on her journey dissolved into a raw, desperate plea. She told him of Jack, of the abandoned cabin, of her son's thirst, of her need for any kind of help. A meal, a safe place to rest, a ride on a supply wagon heading east. Elias stirred in her arms, letting out a weak, fretful cry that seemed to amplify the room's oppressive silence. Thorne's smile widened, but it held no warmth. He recognized the name. Amelia saw it in the subtle flicker of his eyes, a momentary tightening around his mouth that was more than just disinterest. It was a flicker of something sharp, something personal. "Hawthorne," he said, letting the name hang in the air. He swung his boots off the desk with a heavy thud. Leaning forward, he rested his beefy forearms on the wood, the silver coin now still between his fingers. "So you're Jack's little songbird. Heard he finally flew the coop. Can't say I'm surprised. Some men aren't meant for a cage, no matter how pretty the bars." His politeness was a thin veneer over a core of pure menace. "This town has its own problems, Mrs. Hawthorne. Rustlers, grifters, and not enough coin to pay for another mouth to feed. Especially one tied to a man who left a trail of debt and broken promises from here to Cheyenne." He gestured dismissively with his chin. "Your troubles are your own. The West has a way of sorting the strong from the weak. I suggest you find your strength or find a hole to crawl into." Stunned into silence, Amelia could only stare. His rejection was absolute, his tone leaving no room for appeal. As she backed out of the office, the door swinging shut behind her, with a final definitive click, she saw a man step out of the general store across the street. He was older, with a kind, weary face and a white apron stained with flour and molasses. He had clearly witnessed the entire exchange. As she stumbled past her vision, blurring with unshed tears, he pressed something into her hand. It was a thick piece of jerky and a small hard biscuit wrapped in brown paper. "Thorne's got a heart like a stone," the man whispered, his eyes darting toward the sheriff's office. "And a long memory. Be careful. The name Hawthorne carries a heavy price in this town." He retreated back into the shadows of his store before she could thank him. The small act of kindness was a single drop of water in a vast desert of hostility, but it was enough. It was proof that not everyone in this godforsaken place was carved from the same rock as Sheriff Thorne. Clutching the food, she turned her back in Lonesome Gulch and walked back into the wilderness, the sheriff's veiled threat and the store owner's warning echoing in her mind. The conflict was no longer just with the land. It was with a man who knew her husband, a man whose quiet animosity felt far more dangerous than simple indifference. The red wasteland reclaimed her. Miles blurred into a fever dream of heat and despair. By the time she reached a dry creek bed, her knees gave way. She collapsed onto the cracked earth, cradling Elias, whose cries had become weak, guttural gasps for water. The canteen had long since been empty. "Hush, my love." She whispered her own throat, a raw, aching knot. "Mama's here." The words were ally ashes on her tongue. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and crimson. The world was fading at the edges. Then a sound cut through the haze of her delirium. Not the buzz of a rattlesnake, but the soft, deliberate tread of a horse on sandy soil. A figure emerged from the scrub oak, moving with a fluid grace that seemed part of the landscape itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his skin the color of burnished copper. his long black hair braided with a single eagle feather. He was clad in buckskin, and his face was a mask of stoic neutrality, his dark eyes sharp and assessing. He dismounted in one silent motion, a waterskin in his hand. Amelia flinched her instincts, screaming danger, but Elias, with the primal urge of a dying child, lunged for the water, his small hands clawing at the skin. The Cheyenne warrior knelt holding the waterskin steady as Elias drank in desperate gulping swallows. The warrior's gaze met Amelia's. There was no pity in his eyes, but something deeper, a quiet recognition of hardship, a shared understanding of what it meant to be hunted by the unforgiving land. He was practical, his actions speaking louder than any words. He saved the child first. When Elias had drunk his fill and slumped exhausted against her, the warrior finally spoke. His voice was low, like distant thunder. "Come," he said. "The valley will hide you." He helped her to her feet and onto his horse, placing Elias gently in her arms. As they rode toward a hidden cleft in the distant mountains, the last light of the sun vanished, and Lonesome Gulch disappeared behind them, like a bad dream. The warrior's name was Kyle. And though she didn't know it yet, Amelia was riding not just away from death, but into her first true test of survival. The entrance to the valley was a narrow, winding passage, a crack in the granite cliffs that Kyle's horse navigated with uncanny certainty. One moment they were in the open, windswept badlands. The next, they were enveloped by a world of towering pines, cool air, and the scent of damp earth. As they emerged into the valley proper, a hidden sanctuary unfolded before them. A collection of hide-covered teepees stood clustered near a clear, fast-moving stream, smoke curling from their peaks in lazy gray ribbons. This was Kyle's home, a secluded encampment of his Cheyenne band. But as he led the horse into the center of the camp, the welcome was as cold and hard as the granite walls that surrounded them. Warriors stopped sharpening arrowheads to stare, their faces unreadable, but their postures stiff with suspicion. Women paused in their work, their dark eyes lingering on Amelia's pale skin and foreign clothes with open mistrust. They saw not a refugee, but an intruder, a potential threat from the white world that had taken so much from them. Kyle dismounted and helped Amelia down, his grip on her elbow, firm and practical. He spoke in rapid guttural Cheyenne, his words directed at a formidable old woman who had emerged from the largest teepee. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes as sharp and black as obsidian chips. This was Mira, the camp's elder and shaman, a woman whose authority was absolute. Mira's gaze swept over Amelia and Elias, and she spat a single sharp word. Then she physically blocked their path to the fire, her small, wiry frame an immovable barrier. The message was clear. "You are not welcome here." Kyle argued briefly, his tone respectful but firm. Eventually, Mira gave a curt, reluctant nod and gestured toward a small, isolated lodge at the very edge of the camp, set away from the main cluster of families. It was clearly the least desirable a place for outcasts. For weeks, that was what Amelia was, an outcast. She and Elias were ghosts haunting the periphery of camp life. The Cheyenne people did not offer charity. They offered a chance, and the price was grueling labor. Amelia was given the most menial of tasks. She scraped fat from stiff, foul-smelling buffalo hides until her hands were raw and bleeding. She hauled heavy buckets of water from the stream, her back and shoulders screaming in protest. She foraged for firewood on the steep, rocky slopes, her thin boots offering little protection from sharp stones and thorns. She was given scraps of food, the leavings from the communal pot, a tough piece of jerky, a handful of parched corn. She and Elias slept on a pile of old musty robes in the borrowed lodge, the cold seeping up from the ground. The warriors carried their weapons openly when she passed their hands, never straying far from the knives at their belts or the bows slung over their shoulders. The women would fall silent when she approached, turning their backs to resume their conversations in a language she could not understand, their exclusion a wall as solid as the cliffs around her. Her only solace was Elias. Shielded by the innocence of childhood, he was oblivious to the hostility. He would chase butterflies and tumble in the grass, his laughter a strange, bright sound in the tense atmosphere. It was his laughter that first began to chip away at the walls. Leah Kyle's young daughter was the first to succumb. A quiet, watchful girl with her father's serious eyes, she had lost her mother to a fever the previous winter and carried her grief like a shield. At first, she watched Amelia and Elias from a distance, her expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. One afternoon, Elias toddled away from their lodge chasing a grasshopper and stumbled, falling into a patch of scratchy bushes. He began to cry, not from pain, but from surprise and frustration. Before Amelia could reach him, Leah darted forward. She hesitated for only a moment, then gently helped him to his feet, brushing the dirt from his clothes with a surprising tenderness. She murmured something to him in Cheyenne, her voice soft. Elias, his tears forgotten, looked up at her and offered a gap-toothed, brilliant smile. From that day on, a fragile, unspoken friendship began to form between the two children, a bridge built of shared games and silent understanding. Amelia's acceptance, however, would require something far more dramatic. It came with the first storm of winter, a brutal, unseasonable blizzard that descended on the valley without warning, trapping them all in a world of swirling white. The blizzard was not a passing squall. It was a siege. For days the wind howled through the canyon, like a hungry wolf piling snow into massive drifts that buried the entrances to the tipis and made travel impossible. The world shrank to the fire-lit interiors of the lodges, the camp's resources strained to the breaking point. The cold was a physical entity, seeping through the hide walls, and with it came the sickness. It began as a dry cough echoing from one lodge to another. Soon the coughs deepened, turning wet and ragged, and fever followed. Panic, a quiet and deadly predator, began to stalk the camp. The children were the most vulnerable. One by one they succumbed, their small bodies burning with a fever that Mira's traditional remedies of chants and herbal smoke could not break. Mira's granddaughter Nia, a bright-eyed girl of 5, fell ill the hardest. Her breath came in shallow, wheezing gasps, and she thrashed weakly in her grandmother's arms. Mira, her face a mask of iron-willed grief, refused all help. Her suspicion of Amelia now hardened into outright accusation. She saw the sickness as a white man's curse, brought into their sacred valley by the outsider. Amelia, too, felt the familiar tightness in her own chest, the first telltale signs of the lung fever. But watching the children suffer, she was thrown back to her own childhood in the Virginia hills, to her grandmother, a woman who knew the old ways of a different people. She remembered the poultices of mustard seed, the teas brewed from willow bark, to break a fever, the pungent smell of crushed herbs. Desperate, she defied Mira's warnings. She knew the Cheyenne dismissed her knowledge as worthless, the foolish superstitions of a foreign world. She had to prove them wrong. As her own fever began to rise, she stumbled out into the blinding snow, guided by Kyle's earlier lessons on the valley's flora. She found a grove of willow trees by the frozen creek, scraping the bitter inner bark with a sharpened stone. Back in her lodge, she brewed a potent dark tea. The taste was vile, but she drank it down, forcing herself to swallow every drop before collapsing into a feverish sleep. She awoke hours later, drenched in sweat, but the fire in her lungs had cooled to embers. Her fever had broken. It was enough. Carrying a small pot of the willow bark tea, she went to Mira's lodge. The old woman tried to block her way, her eyes blazing with fury and fear. "Witch, you will not take her. Your ways have failed. Amelia said, her voice hoarse but steady. Let me try mine. If I fail, you can cast me out into the storm. But if you do nothing, Nia will die. The raw desperation in Mira's eyes warred with a lifetime of pride and prejudice. At last, with a choked sob, she stepped aside. For 2 days and nights, Amelia sat by Nia's side. She gently forced spoonfuls of the bitter tea past the girl's lips. She brewed other remedies from memory, using crushed roots she recognized from the camp's own stores to make a poultice for Nia's chest. The healing was not swift or miraculous. It was a battle filled with tense setbacks and moments when Nia's breathing seemed to stop altogether. On the morning of the 3rd day, the blizzard finally broke. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the clouds, Nia's eyes fluttered open. The fever was gone. Her breathing, though weak, was even and clear. Mira sank to her knees, her trembling hands touching her granddaughter's cool forehead. She looked up at Amelia, her face streaked with tears. She said nothing. Words were not needed. Later that evening, as Amelia sat alone in her cold, isolated lodge, Mira entered silently. She placed a thick, warm buffalo robe around Amelia's shoulders and set a bowl of rich, steaming stew by her side. Then she gestured for Amelia to follow her to the central fire where the heart of the camp beat. She pointed to a place beside her, a place of honor. It was a silent gesture of acceptance that spoke louder than any proclamation. In the crucible of the blizzard, the outsider had finally earned her place. The fragile peace that settled over the valley was shattered by the return of a lone Cheyenne scout, his horse lathered and his face grim. He brought news from the world beyond the cliffs, news that made the blood run cold in Amelia's veins. Sheriff Thorne was on the move. He wasn't just coming with a small posse. He was amassing a force in Lonesome Gulch, spinning a venomous tale to rally the townsfolk. The public story was a lie crafted for maximum outrage. Thorne was telling everyone that the reckless prospector Jack Hawthorne had discovered a massive gold vein in the hidden valley. According to his tale, the savage Cheyenne had murdered Jack for his discovery, stolen his gold, and kidnapped his defenseless wife and child. He was painting himself as a hero mounting a rescue mission to save the widow and reclaim the land for civilized folk. But the scout brought back something more than just rumors. He had ambushed one of Thorne's advance riders and recovered a saddlebag. Inside, among the ammunition and dried beef, was a worn leather journal. That evening, by the flickering light of the fire, Kyle handed the journal to Amelia. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Jack's. The last few weeks of his life were scrawled across the pages in a messy, arrogant hand, fueled by whiskey and self-pity. As she read, the blood drained from her face. The truth was far more twisted and personal than a simple hunt for gold. The journal revealed the first shocking twist: Jack Hawthorne was Elias Thorne's younger brother. The entries painted a damning picture. Thorne, it turned out, was not just a small-town sheriff. He was the stern, powerful head of the family, a man who had spent years trying to control his wild, irresponsible sibling. Jack's entries were filled with resentment for his overbearing brother, who constantly bailed him out of trouble while lecturing him on his failures. The rich gold vein was a complete fabrication, a desperate lie Jack had concocted to swindle more money out of his brother. He had written to Thorne claiming to have made a massive discovery and needing funds for equipment, promising to cut him in on the fortune. But the most chilling passages were about her. Amelia is the anchor around my neck. One entry read, always with her sad eyes and her talk of responsibility. Thorne thinks she's some Eastern saint, but she's the one who drove me to this. If I fail, it will be her fault. The world tilted under Amelia's feet. Thorne's vendetta wasn't about gold. He likely knew the gold was a lie, another of his brother's pathetic schemes. His obsession was with her. In his mind, she was the corrupting influence who had led his brother to ruin, and he now believed to his death at the hands of the Cheyenne. Thorn was coming for revenge, and he was coming for the only thing he had left of his brother's bloodline, his nephew Elias. He didn't want to rescue her. He wanted to take her son. The weight of this revelation was crushing. The fight was no longer for a piece of land. It was for her child against a man who saw her as the architect of his family's tragedy. He was not a greedy stranger, but a grieving man, twisted by a desire for vengeance, armed with the power of the law, and fueled by a lie of his own brother's making. The coming storm was not a posse. It was family business, and it was aimed directly at her heart. Thorn's attack was not a chaotic charge, but a calculated siege. His posse, a mix of hardened deputies and local ranchers, lured by the promise of gold and justice, sealed the narrow entrance to the valley with a barricade of felled trees and rock slides. They established a camp on the ridge above their rifles, controlling the high ground. The valley, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. The Cheyenne, led by Kyle, refused to be cornered. They were masters of this terrain. At night they moved like ghosts, launching swift, silent guerrilla raids on Thorn's encampment. They sabotaged supply lines, spooked horses, and picked off sentries with well-aimed arrows, melting back into the shadows before the posse could mount a response. But Thorn's forces were too numerous and too well-armed. For every small victory the Cheyenne won, the siege tightened. Food became scarce as hunting grounds were cut off. The camp grew tense, the specter of starvation and defeat looming larger each day. The second obstacle, the one that threatened to break them completely, came during a moonless night. Kyle had led a small party on a daring raid to destroy the posse's water barrels. The raid was a success, but the retreat was compromised. In the chaos of gunfire and shouting, one of Thorn's men managed to get behind their lines. The target wasn't a warrior. It was Laya. She had secretly followed her father, wanting to prove her bravery, and had been hiding in the rocks nearby. A single terrified cry cut through the night. By the time Kyle realized what had happened, it was too late. Thorn's men had his daughter. The next morning, a lone rider approached the valley under a white flag. He carried a message from Thorn, its terms simple and brutal. He would exchange the girl for Amelia and her son. 1 life for 2. The demand struck the camp like a lightning bolt, creating a moral crisis that threatened to tear the tribe apart. A tense council was convened around the central fire. Fear and pragmatism warred with loyalty. Some argued that the choice was obvious. Why should the entire tribe risk annihilation for an outsider and her child? They had their own to protect. Laya was their blood. "We barely know this white woman," one warrior argued, his voice sharp with grief. "Her fight has become our death sentence. We must save the girl." Mira, who had once been Amelia's fiercest opponent, now rose to her defense. "This woman healed our children when my own knowledge failed," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "She stood with us. We do not sacrifice those who have earned a place by our fire. To do so would be to lose our honor, and then we would have nothing left." But the debate raged on, tearing at the newly forged bonds of trust. Amelia watched her heart a cold stone in her chest. She saw the anguish in Kyle's face, the impossible choice he was being forced to make between his duty to his people, his love for his daughter, and his loyalty to her. She knew she could not let them make that choice. That night she went to Kyle. "I will go," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will not be the cause of your daughter's death or your people's destruction. This is my fight, It always has been. Kyle's face was a mask of torment, but he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. It was not a surrender. It was a sacrifice. He knew he could not let her go alone. A new plan began to form, a desperate gamble born of a terrible choice. They would agree to the exchange, but it would be on their terms, in a place of their choosing. They would turn Thorn's trap back on him. The exchange was set for dawn, in a place the Cheyenne called the Canyon of Whispers. A narrow, winding gorge where the fog settled thick as wool, and the slightest sound echoed unnervingly off the sheer rock walls. A storm was brewing in the mountains, the wind already starting to howl through the pass, carrying the scent of rain and the low rumble of distant thunder. Amelia rode between Kyle and two other warriors, her face pale but resolute. Elias was strapped securely to her chest, his small face buried in her coat. They reached the designated clearing, a small flat area surrounded by towering, unstable scree slopes. Thorn and a half-dozen of his men were waiting. Laya held tightly by a grim-faced deputy, her eyes wide with fear. The standoff was electric with tension. The boy first, Thorn commanded, his voice barely rising above the shriek of the wind. The girl Kyle countered, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. They began the slow, cautious walk toward the center. As Amelia passed Laya back to a waiting Cheyenne warrior, Thorn grabbed her arm, his grip like an iron manacle. He was close enough now for her to see the full depth of the madness and grief in his eyes. "You think this is about gold, don't you?" he hissed, his face contorted. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a familiar object, dangling it before her eyes. It was her mother's silver locket, its surface tarnished, swinging on its delicate chain. "He had this on him when I found him." This was the final devastating twist. He didn't just vanish. Thorn snarled, his voice cracking with a pain he could no longer contain. "He rode out of your life and straight off a cliff 3 days later, drunk and broken. I found his body at the bottom of a ravine, smashed on the rocks. He died because of you. You and your whining, your demands, your constant disappointment. You broke him. You killed my brother." His confession was raw, absolute. He genuinely believed every word. In his twisted narrative, he was the avenger of his family's pain. He reached for Elias, his intentions clear. He was taking his nephew, the last piece of his brother he could salvage from the wreckage. Just as his fingers brushed against Elias's coat, Kyle let out a sharp cry, the piercing call of a hawk. It was the signal. High above, hidden on the canyon rim, Cheyenne warriors heaved against massive, precariously balanced boulders. With a deep, guttural groan, the mountainside gave way. A rockslide far larger and more chaotic than planned thundered down into the gorge. It wasn't a neat trap. It was an avalanche of raw, destructive power. The world dissolved into a deafening roar of grinding stone and panicked shouts. The rockslide didn't just block the posse's escape, it separated them. A wall of rubble slammed down between Kyle's warriors and the clearing, cutting them off. When the dust began to settle, Amelia found herself in an isolated pocket of terrifying silence, trapped with the two men who defined her life, her son and the man who wanted to take him. Thorn, dazed but uninjured, rose from the debris, his face a mask of pure fury. The climax was no longer a battle of posses and warriors. It was an intimate, desperate fight in the dust and chaos. He lunged for her. The struggle was brutal and clumsy. He was driven by rage, but Amelia was fueled by something far more powerful, the primal instinct of a mother protecting her child. She kicked, scratched, and bit, using the terrain to her advantage, ducking behind boulders, scrambling over loose rock. She wasn't fighting to win. She was fighting to survive. As he grabbed for Elias again, she saw her chance. Her hand closed around a sharp-edged piece of granite. She swung it with all her might, striking him on the side of the head. Thorn staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before collapsing into the dust, wounded and unconscious. Panting, bruised, and covered in grime, Amelia stood over him. She reached down and gently pried the silver locket from his limp fingers, its cool metal, a solid, comforting weight in her palm. The storm finally broke, and cold rain began to fall, washing the dust from the air. The roar of the rock slide faded, replaced by the desperate shouts of Kyle and his warriors, as they clawed at the wall of rubble separating them from Amelia. It took what felt like an eternity, but finally they broke through. Kyle rushed to her side, his eyes filled with a frantic relief that shattered his stoic facade when he saw that she and Elias were safe. Laia was already in the arms of one of the warriors, unharmed. The posse, leaderless and broken by the terrifying power of the mountain, had had enough. The surviving members helped their wounded sheriff onto a horse and began a slow, humiliating retreat from the valley, leaving their ambitions buried under tons of rock. Back in the Cheyenne camp, there was no celebration. The mood was quiet, somber. They had survived, but the cost had been high, the scars on their peace deep. That evening, a formal ceremony was held around the central fire. Mira, her face solemn in the flickering light, stood before Amelia. She placed a hand on Amelia's shoulder and gave her a new name, in the Cheyenne tongue, Neho'oe, she who walks with the wind. It was a formal adoption, a declaration that the outsider was no longer an outsider. She was a daughter of the tribe, her place among them sealed not by blood, but by fire and sacrifice. Later, as the camp settled into an exhausted sleep, Amelia found Kyle sitting alone, watching the dying embers of the fire. They sat in silence for a long time, the unspoken emotions of the day hanging between them. "You saved my daughter," he said finally, his voice low. "You were willing to give up your own son for her." "She is one of you," Amelia replied softly. "And you are the ones who saved me. It wasn't a choice." He nodded, understanding. The bond between them had been forged in shared loss and tempered by mutual respect. It was not the fleeting heat of romance, but something deeper, more enduring, the quiet strength of two survivors who had found an unlikely family in the heart of a hostile world. He had lost his wife. She had lost her past. Together in this hidden valley, they had begun to build a future from the pieces that remained. Weeks passed. The crisp air of autumn gave way to the sharp, clean bite of early winter. The first true snow began to fall, not with the violence of the blizzard, but as soft, silent flakes that blanketed the valley in a pristine layer of white. The world felt new, washed clean. Amelia took Elias to a quiet overlook, a small clearing of pines that offered a panoramic view of their sanctuary. The smoke from the camp's fires rose in steady columns into the cold, still air. The valley was at peace. She held the silver locket in her hand, its surface now polished and bright. She opened the small clasp. Inside was the tiny, faded portrait of her mother, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a face from another lifetime. She knelt in the snow and told Elias a story. It was not a Cheyenne legend of spirits and stars, but her own story, a story of a green place far to the east, of a grandmother who could heal with herbs, and of a mother who had loved her daughter very much. She told him about the woman in the locket, his grandmother he would never know, and the promise the locket represented. Elias listened, his blue eyes wide, his small hand holding hers. When the story was finished, she kissed the locket one last time. Then, with a quiet finality, she used a flat stone to dig a small hole in the frozen earth at the base of a young, resilient pine tree. She placed the locket inside and covered it with soil and snow. The act was a release. She was not erasing her past, but planting it, letting it become part of this new land. She was letting go of the pain of her marriage, the grief for a life that could never be, and the ghost of Jack Hawthorne. Her identity was no longer tied to a silver trinket from a forgotten world. It was forged here in this valley, among these people. She stood up, taking Elias's hand. Together, they walked back toward the warm, welcoming glow of the campfires. As they approached, Laia ran out to meet them, her laughter bright and clear in the winter air. She took Elias's other hand, and the three of them walked on together, their small figures framed against the vast, quiet landscape. It was not an ending that promised easy happiness, but one that held the deep, resonant strength of earned peace.